Well, welcome everyone to our UAB CFIR Implementation Science Consultation Hub monthly seminar series. We are very fortunate and thankful to have Dr. Allison Barley here to present. Allison is a research health scientist with the Birmingham VA Medical Center and Director of Implementation Science and Engagement with the Heart Rhythm Clinical and Research Solutions. She's also a researcher with clinical and population health sciences. And we are just so very thankful to have her also as one of our implementation science consultants, experts, co-investigators with our implementation science hub, and just thrilled to have her today to talk about the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, better known as CFIR, today to talk about CFIR 2.0 and all of her work and how she's incorporating it. So thank you, Allison.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. The weather here is kind of bad. So like once I share my screen, I'm gonna turn my camera off just while I'm presenting so that I make sure my internet can handle it. But I'm excited to talk about the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research today. Full disclosure, I've used the original framework frequently in my work. And then, in some of the work, the qualitative work that I've done, I find that some of the stuff that they've done in CFIR 2.0, we've worked into our work, but it wasn't, I've never necessarily done anything under the lens of like the new framework. So what I'll present is very much from like what I've read and presentations I've watched on it. And then the work that I've done has been kind of focused in the original framework. Okay. So are you seeing everything like correct now?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, cool. So let's see. So here's just funding and disclosures. So one of the projects that I'll mention briefly is funded by the VA's Query program. My dissertation work was funded by the UAB Center for Outcomes and Effectiveness Research and Education. I have part-time employment with HRCRS, and none of the views in this presentation represent the Department of Veteran Affairs or any other organization. So I will cover the following. So briefly, just kind of a background behind frameworks and determinant frameworks, which I know Larry has covered at length, but just as a tiny reminder. Then I'll introduce the original framework. I also should have updated this, but I'll also briefly mention the CFIR outcomes addendum, which was kind of developed in unison with the CFIR 2.0 updates. Then I'll get into the CFIR 2.0 updates and then some examples of why I use CFIR, and I call it CFIR too, because the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research is a mouthful. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm just going to kind of briefly review a small part of Larry's presentation from December. So as a reminder, a framework is a structure or system of descriptive categories. They don't provide explanations. They describe phenomena by fitting them into sets of categories. And frameworks are helpful because they can help you systematically organize, collect, and analyze and interpret data. So the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which is what this entire presentation is about, is considered to be a determinant framework, which means it helps explore and identify factors that influence implementation outcomes. And we frequently see determinant frameworks used to identify and explore barriers and facilitators and answer questions like, why will an intervention work in a specific setting, and what's moderating implementation success? So as for those of us that are interested in implementation science and probably have listened to any presentations or anything, and I'm pretty sure that Larry also touches on this, there are tons of implementation science theories, models, and frameworks. So this team that originally conceptualized the CFIR sought to consolidate the major determinant constructs that were in these theories, models, and frameworks into one kind of overarching framework, which is detailed in this paper. And from that paper and project came the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CFIR. And it's one of the most frequently cited and used implementation science determinant frameworks. And it consists of 5 major domains with constructs nested within each of these. And I'm going to briefly review the original constructs before I get into like the constructs as they look now that they've been updated. So the first domain covered in the Consolidated Framework is intervention characteristics, which are defined as the key attributes of the intervention or practice, and how that influences the success of implementation. And so the domains include constructs like intervention source, evidence strength and quality, relative advantage, adaptability, complexity, and cost. So then the second domain would be characteristics of individuals, which originally focused very heavily on the individuals that were delivering the intervention and practice. And so constructs within the original characteristics of individuals involved included knowledge and beliefs of the intervention, self-efficacy, individual stages of change, and individual identification with the organization. So then the next construct is the inner setting, and the inner setting refers to the setting in which the innovation is being implemented. And, you know, if you think to some of the work you've probably done, inner setting can be multiple settings and can exist at multiple levels. I think in one of the presentations I was listening to, you know, they frequently referred to school. So there's the classroom, then there's other larger units in the school, and that can all be considered the inner setting. But, you know, as far as domains in the CFIR, this is, I think, one of the larger ones that has probably more concepts than the others. And some of the original domains in the inner setting, original constructs that were in the inner setting domain include structural characteristics, networks and communications, culture, implementation climate, and readiness for implementation. And so these are the kind of last 2 of those 5 domains. The next one being the outer setting, which is the setting in which the inner setting exists. And again, like the inner setting, there could be multiple outer settings. And so I always think of it as, you know, settings that are outside of the organization or that kind of unit you're considering the inner setting. And so the original constructs within this domain included patient needs and resources, cosmopolitanism, peer pressure, external policies and incentives. And I should mention that I'll get into some of the constructs a little bit more as we discuss CFIR 2.0, but Lakin, I earlier today dropped in a bunch of different like resources. I mean, mostly from cfirguide.org, which I also cover in this presentation, but there's like, you know, tons of different constructs and lots of different definitions. So I didn't want to just do that the whole time. And so I do have some like resources if there's anything specific, and you can also stop me if you have questions about anything. So then the last domain is processes, which they define as the activities and strategies used to implement the innovation. And the original constructs included planning, engaging different participants in the implementation process, executing, and then reflecting and evaluating. And so this is the not so pretty or easy to understand graphic that they had in the original paper. And it just kind of shows how, you have the inner setting and then the outer setting as, outside of the organization. Then you've got the individuals involved in implementation who are also kind of driving that implementation process aspect of it. And in the CFIR 2.0 paper, they don't have any like really wonderful graphics, but Laura Damschroeder has given several presentations on CFIR 2.0, and I think the graphics that they're building to explain this are much lovelier now. So as I mentioned, before I get into CFIR 2.0, I thought I would briefly discuss another supplementary resource for CFIR users that was also created out of this initiative to improve the original framework and its use. And so this is the CFIR Outcomes Addendum, which outlines outcomes that can be used with the CFIR, and specifically what types of implementation outcomes are driven by determinants like those outlined in the framework. Within the addendum, they differentiate between CFIR implementation determinants, which focus on implementation context, versus innovation determinants, which are also listed in some aspects in the framework, specifically in the newer one. And then they further kind of specify the differences between innovation outcomes and then CFIR related implementation outcomes. And so here is the table that I ripped off of cfirguide.org that defines the different types of outcomes outlined in the paper. So you can see they differentiate between anticipated and implementation outcomes and actual implementation outcomes. And then they also define a category of antecedent assessments, which can be used to predict the anticipated or actual implementation outcomes. So that's the CFIR like outcomes addendum, and that was kind of part of the CFIR 2.0 process, because a lot of the feedback that they got I guess on the original CFIR was that it needed to be closer connected to like implementation outcomes, and implementation outcomes needed to be worked into the framework. So now going on to the CFIR 2.0 and the updates from the original framework. So in the paper, they kind of explain that they embarked on this kind of process of reviewing studies that had previously used the framework to identify how it was used, adapted, or added onto. And then they also went and surveyed authors who had published on the CFIR to get feedback on improving the frameworks and constructs. And so what I'll do is kind of go through each of the CFIR domains like I just did, but then I'm going to explain how they changed each domain and how they updated the constructs. I will note that in this like CFIR 2.0 paper, if you look at it online, there's like an online supplement that maps out the changes in each of the domains. That's incredibly helpful if you're really trying to understand, at the end of the day, if this, I don't explain it well, there's a really nice like map available. And I also downloaded that and saved that to our shared folder, Lakin. So first, before I kind of get into the domains, they make a few kind of overarching recommendations about how to really use the framework. One of which was the inclusion of the outcomes addendum I just summarized, but as far as like applying the framework, they note that it's important to define your domains. So, we just went through like inner setting, and that's like relatively vague. And so if you were doing, a project, for example, like the one that I'll present shortly, where we were focused on buprenorphine prescription in hospitalized patients, like that, we would define the inner setting as, the hospital unit, or that the unit of hospitalists, that where we're kind of targeting in that, as well as potentially the hospital. And then, you know, the Department of Veterans Affairs would potentially be on the outer setting, which is the entire health system. And then, you know, defining what the innovation is, which I'll actually explain here in a few minutes how we did that. But again, they really kind of stress that in order to really use this framework, you need to take that broad language and really make it specific to your project. And so the next kind of overarching change that we see in the framework is centering around humans, specifically around the recipients of the innovation. And they really made an effort to kind of differentiate between the people who are delivering the innovation and then recipients, like through all of the domain updates, as the two often require different strategies for implementation. And then, as I mentioned, I watched like a bunch of Laura Damschroeder's recent presentations, and she provides examples of some of the feedback where participants in the survey highlighted some areas of like ambiguity or confusion in some of the constructs like throughout. And so you'll see that like some things that were potentially double-barreled have now been broken out into two constructs. And then other things have just had language changes. And so I would say these are kind of the three overarching major updates and kind of messages that they send as far as like how they wanted to update it. So to review the updated changes, like I said, I'm going to kind of show you the old domains and then show you the new domains. And so this one right here is a characteristic of individuals involved. And I know that I kind of already listed out all of the original constructs. So this is what it looked like in the original framework. And so now this is the updated domain and constructs. And so you'll see it really kind of focuses on two overarching themes. So two overarching themes, roles and characteristics of the individual. And so you see that in the roles domain, you assess the extent to which these individuals, like for example, high-level leaders, are a part of the implementation effort. It helps you identify all of the roles applicable to the implementation initiative. And again, this is really just part of this effort to kind of define who are the people involved. And then another thing that they kind of note furthermore specifically to the individuals involved is that as you're specifying who's involved in your implementation effort, you want to note where they sit within the implementation. So in the inner setting, outer setting. So just being as specific as possible to like who's involved and where they sit. And so then they also created this characteristics construct, which was, I think, you know, originally was very much this like kind of focused on this aspect of it. So characteristics of individuals involved. However, none of this was really based on any specific theory. And so what they've done is they've updated it by using the constructs from the COM-B framework. And that includes individuals' capability, opportunity, and motivation to implement the innovation. And so these are the updated constructs for assessing individuals involved in implementation. And so then the next domain was intervention characteristics. And so then these are the updates that they made to this. This is actually the domain that changed the least as far as the update goes. I think, you know, one of the things they stress is the importance of defining the thing that's being implemented. And so in order to improve clarity on these constructs, they really just went and added like innovation to the beginning of it. So instead of just saying cost, we're really looking at the cost of the innovation, the innovation's design, its trialability, you know, its evidence base. Okay, so then the next domain is the inner setting, and this one did change quite a bit. if you read the CFIR 2.0 paper, you'll see that they did get a lot of feedback on perhaps implementation climate and culture being a little bit vague. In one of the presentations, they said, someone said, when I don't know where to put something, I put it in culture. And I definitely felt that. I feel like I've done that when using the consolidated framework to analyze qualitative data. So they refined, multiple constructs, starting with structural characteristics. And so now you'll see that instead of just saying vaguely structural characteristics, they include, these specific types of characteristics: physical infrastructure, IT infrastructure, work infrastructure. And then they also updated networks and communication to be two separate constructs. So you'll see now it's relational connections and communications. Again, just kind of, especially when you're trying to code things qualitatively, removing, double barrel meanings, I think is really helpful. And so now this kind of gets at networks and communications separately. Again, they made culture a little bit more specific. As I mentioned, that some of the feedback was that was vague, and they've broken it down into, recipient centeredness, delivery centeredness, learning centeredness, and human equality centeredness. So that so when you're assessing the culture of any organization, these are kind of the four constructs that you want to be looking at. They also updated, and I'm sorry, I'm getting lost on everything. Yeah, so they also updated, so you can see tension for change, compatibility, relative priority didn't change, but they did add this incentive systems specific to the organization, to this domain. And then they refined what used to be called goals and feedback to be mission alignment, which they define as the extent to which the implementation of the innovation is in line with the overarching purpose or goals of the organization or setting. And I personally appreciated this update because before it was goals and feedback. And sometimes I got that kind of confused with the reflecting and evaluating in the process domain. And so I think this mission alignment and incentive systems does a better job at getting at, what they're specifically saying could be a potential determinant within the inner setting. So then the next domain was the outer setting. So now this one has changed a lot. And so you can see they've added several constructs and removed several that were on there before. No surprise. And, after Robin listening to the presentations from the EHE conference, we saw that, a major kind of implementation determinant was certainly this idea of critical incidents, which would be, some type of event that happens that gets in the way of implementation efforts. And, one of the examples they provide is COVID-19. So that's something that they've added that can really influence, implementation efforts. And then again, we see that they've added additional constructs to improve the patient and person-centeredness of the framework. So instead of having the single patient needs category, they've embedded these constructs in each of the CFIR domains. But in the outer setting, they've added some socio-ecological characteristics like local attitudes and local conditions to capture some of the economic, cultural, and political systems that may be outer setting barriers to implementation efforts. So again, I think they try and focus on the people more so in the individuals section, but here these are kind of those, what we very frequently think of are the external socio-ecologic factors at play that we very frequently take account for in our work. And so then they went and clarified some of the older constructs with new language. So you'll see that cosmopolitanism, which I did is now partnerships and connections. They also refined external policies and incentives by making it more specific. And now they've got policies and laws. And then they also improved peer pressure. And so for there, they've again made it more specific. So societal pressure, market pressure, and then performance measurement pressure, which would be like quality metrics. And then they also included financing, which I think, again, just breaking apart some of these terms that were a little bit broader now to very specific topics that they wanted to cover. And so, I'm sorry. Yeah. So then the last domain, I think I forgot to put the implementation processes. I'm sorry. I forgot to put the implementation processes from the old CFIR. And so now I just have the new one up here. I apologize. But however, as we saw, it's very similar. You know, there was planning, engaging, reflecting, and evaluating. They did have in the engaging, it was like a lot of different types of leaders. And so now they've just broken it down into engaging innovation delivers and innovation recipients. Okay, so now I'm going to get back on track. Okay, so on what happened. So I will say that, you know, I really like the addition of assessing needs. Again, it breaks that down into assessing the needs of the people who are going to be delivering the innovation, and then assessing the needs of the people who are going to be receiving the intervention. And then like my favorite of all of the additions is this addition of teaming, which they draw from Amy Edmondson's definition, which refers to joining together intentionally to coordinate or collaborate implementation efforts. And in a lot of the work that I've done specifically within like opioid prescribing and substance use, you know, a lot of our work that comes out of needs assessments is, you know, the importance of the team and having the team on board and having them work together. And so I was really happy to see this one added. And then you'll see they've added additional, you know, assessing needs and assessing context. They've also added tailoring strategies as one of the processes. And then again, like I said, instead of listing out all of those different, you know, players that, or because I think it's like champions, high level leaders, all of that good stuff. Now it's just talking about engaging innovation deliverers and innovation recipients. And so they changed executing to doing. And so, and then that's defined, you know, a little bit differently. And then they've also added, the construct of adapting. And so the extent to which the innovation is adapted during the implementation process. And so that kind of summarizes the major changes in the domains and how, you know, how the constructs were originally and then updated. And so next I thought I would share some of the reasons why I like using the CFIR. And so as we just kind of reviewed, I believe it to be a super comprehensive framework when it comes to evaluating implementation determinants. And it really makes me feel like I'm kind of covering all of my bases when doing any kind of implementation focused needs assessment. You know, it's super easy to assess barriers and facilitators. I really like that the authors of both the CFIR and the ERIC list of implementation strategies have worked to link the constructs of the Consolidated Framework to implementation strategies that are listed in that compilation. So then, as I've mentioned kind of throughout this, the CFIRguide.org website is such a wonderful website. It's got all different kinds of tools, all different types of links to resources, and really just like makes it easy to use the CFIR and do this type of work. And then I also like that there are, you know, there's a lot of published examples and a lot of existing measures that are built around this. And so you can really kind of comprehensively assess implementation determinants, and then also assess your the impact of your implementation strategies on those determinants, because that's like what we have to target when we're building implementation strategies. And so I think it just is kind of like a one-stop shop for really kind of understanding and then assessing those aspects of implementation. And so, as I mentioned, one of the benefits of using the framework is that the constructs have been matched to the ERIC strategies. And what ERIC is a list or compilation of implementation strategies that were created through a consensus of implementation experts. And so then, there's like, I know several published lists related to ERIC, but that Powell 2015 one is, I think, the most frequently used. So then the CFIR-ERIC Matching Tool was developed based on survey responses from implementation experts who were asked to choose up to 7 implementation strategies that they believed would address each CFIR barrier. There was a lot of heterogeneity in people's opinions. Thus, the recommendations are mixed, and only a handful, which you'll see, are widely endorsed to match specific barriers. And so I like to read verbatim from the guidelines for using the ERIC matching tool when I say that I use this, because I think there's like a huge caveat. So they say the extent to which the results apply to your unique setting is an open question. The results from the CFIR-ERIC matching study may help inform implementation planning efforts, but cannot be a substitute for context and content-specific analysis of needs for a specific initiative. We encourage being cautious in applying the recommendations encapsulated in this tool and testing whether they lead to successful implementation. And so when I use the tool, it's never acting as like the final say on strategy selection. I really use it as like an activity that we can use for brainstorming potential strategies, or in a case where we've collected some data and we're, putting together potential strategies based on other, data or reasons, we can then kind of put some of our barriers into the CFIR-ERIC matching tool and somewhat validate I guess not necessarily validate, but look and see if experts recommended what we were thinking. And it's really just kind of to brainstorm. I have used it personally to brainstorm selection not selection, but generating implementation strategies. So here's a brief example of how I recently used multiple CFIR related tools. I was the implementation scientist on the Options project, which was like a multi-site study aimed to improve adoption of practices related to opioid use disorder using implementation facilitation as an implementation strategy. And Options specifically focused on buprenorphine prescribing within the inpatient hospital service. So we started out, so one, I think, important first step on this project was we started out by specifying the innovations and behaviors that we were specifically trying to target. So, broadly, our team was told that we needed to increase access to medications for opioid use disorder within hospitalized patients. And so, we started talking to champions and other people that were going to be involved in the implementation effort, and really kind of broke that down into what actual practices there's multiple steps involved in that. And so we broke down the innovation into the multiple steps that kind of had to happen in order to give people access to these medications. And so we defined both like the practices and the behavior. So identifying patients with harmful opioid use and diagnosing them, initiating the medication for opioid use disorder, prescribing, and then effectively connecting them to outpatient care, which we referred to as referring. One of the like overarching goals was to get more hospitalists to become X-waivered. However, during that project, they ended the X waiver. So fortunately, we don't have to worry about that anymore. But so once we kind of decided what the practices we were targeting were, we did this kind of rapid needs assessment where we used a very short and modified version of the CFIR interview guide, and we tailored it. Again, the purpose of identifying these practices because we then took the CFIR interview guide and tailored all of that broad language to these four specific practices. And then the way that we analyzed all of the data following this, we're focused on these 3 or 4 specific practices. But yeah, so to collect a lot of our data, we did these very short qualitative interviews that were guided by CFIR with pretty much anyone that was interacting with inpatient, care of patients for opioid use disorder. So from there, we used a rapid qualitative approach to apply the CFIR codebook, also available on cfirguide.org, to our interview summary. So we went through and summarized all of our interviews and then applied the codebook to that. And we did that, for one of the purposes was so that we could use that CFIR-ERIC Matching Tool and then continue down on this very iterative path of identifying strategies, getting feedback from, our very large group of stakeholders on them, refining them, and then trying to deploy them. And so this is just an example of some of the barriers that we found, and you could see as we presented them, we also labeled the CFIR construct that they went along with. And so then this is just an example of our coding matrix that we use. So we summarized each of the interviews, and then we went and, we broke everything down into CFIR domains. And then we listed, and it was probably a little too much, but we listed like diagnosis, barriers and facilitators, prescribing, barriers and facilitators, referrals, barriers and facilitators, and did that by each CFIR domain. And so here you can see, we marked like access to knowledge and information. The outpatient substance use clinic is the only avenue that, this clinician was aware of as far as where to send people or get assistance for medications for opioid use disorder. And again, a lack of knowledge of where to send people. So that's how we labeled that. And all of this, again, helped us then put it into the CFIR-ERIC Matching Tool. And so this is what it looks like. It's essentially an Excel-based tool that you can download off of the website. And you see it kind of lists all of these CFIR constructs. Note that I think this is still based off of the original framework. I don't know if they have any plans on updating it, but anyways, all that to say that these are still very much the older constructs, and the domains are the same, but the constructs are different. So what you see here is if you're using this tool, so for example, anything that we coded as a barrier, we put in here, you would mark it as a 1. And so then you run the program and it gives you this massive kind of matrix of ratings. And this is the percent of the experts that responded to it and said this would be a strategy to overcome that specific CFIR barrier. So you can see that for a barrier of identifying and preparing, the barrier would be culture focused. One of the top strategies that experts recommend to overcome barriers related to culture were identifying and preparing champions. And then implementation climate, as far as that being a barrier, you can see that in this specific project, experts recommended assessing for readiness and identifying barriers and facilitators as the best strategy to overcome issues with implementation climate. And so, and I think this refers to 50%, 52% of people rated this as one of the strategies to overcome this barrier. And so then you can see here, access to knowledge and information, if that's a barrier, it looks like 79% of respondents said conducting educational meetings would be an appropriate strategy to overcome that barrier. So that's really how the CFIR-ERIC Matching Tool works. And then this is just an example of how we kind of went from having these barriers, then having the ERIC recommended strategy, and then tailoring it, taking it back and tailoring it to the specific context to our project. And, some of this involved just looking at these and saying, okay, well, this fits this, but we also had some other activities where we got, people to vote on different things as far as what they thought was the easiest to implement and most feasible. It was very much an iterative process of like interviewing people, looking at potential strategies, and then kind of doing different consensus generating activities to get people to tailor these to our specific setting. So then the next tool, which I've talked about like the whole time, is the CFIR guide website. This is where you can, if you go to the section that's like tools, you'll see the CFIR-ERIC Matching Tool. They've also, as you can see, included a lot of information about the CFIR 2.0 update. And so, yeah, I really love the CFIRguide.org, and it has like qualitative, a lot of different qualitative analytic tools, like a CFIR interview guide, which I really love and I use all the time. And then it also has you know, a code book. If you want to, then if you do the CFIR interview guide and then want to code like we did, they have that. And then I think they also have, you know, different repositories of measures. You know, this is actually not on CFIRguide.org. This is from the Society for Implementation Research and Practice, but they also have a compendium of CFIR domains and measures that link to different CFIR domains. This is linked to on the CFIRguide.org website, along with a few other instrument repositories. But I really love this one. You do have to be a member of CIRC to access this, but it's a really, I mean, I really like it and find myself frequently visiting it. So that's, you know, one reason why I like, it's just very, the CFIR is very comprehensive, and there's been a lot of work done around it. And so, you know, here's another example of a resource for measurement of constructs within the inner setting. You'll see that this paper provides some psychometrically sound assessments for constructs within the inner setting, like culture, implementation, climate, leadership engagement, and many more. This I also dropped in the shared folder for you, Lakin. So then here's my shameless plug of my CFIR-based measurement that I made as a part of my dissertation. I used the CFIR interview guide to assess kind of barriers and facilitators to providing evidence-based care or best practices for patients that had both chronic pain and opioid use disorder. And I share this just to show that, you know, I started with qualitative data, used that qualitative data to develop this measure, and then came out with a measure that actually does get at a lot of different constructs within the consolidated framework. And so, you know, we see that we measure motivation, teaming, available resources. Oh, that shouldn't have been motivation. That should actually say the evidence source. I didn't do that right. Needs of patients and cost. And so, you know, my thought with this is that I had all of these tools, and so I could assess kind of barriers and facilitators to implementing these best practices. And now I've developed this tool that kind of will help me evaluate whether or not an implementation strategy that I designed based on that work is actually moving the needle as far as people's motivation to provide this treatment, their available resources to provide this treatment, and, you know, their patients' ability to afford these treatments. So if I were going to target any of those with implementation strategies, the systematic work with the CFIR allows me to then evaluate those constructs here. So yeah, to summarize, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research was developed to combine important constructs related to implementation determinants into one framework. The CFIR 2.0 and Outcomes Addendum improves the original framework by centering it around humans and clarifying concepts that were reported as confusing, as well as linking some of the implementation and innovation outcomes to this determinant framework. And then, I like CFIR because there are lots of tools and there's lots of evidence on how to do it. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Allison. Let me just say, those are the cutest dogs ever.
Thank you.
Oh, so cute. What kind of dogs are they?
So Chester, he's not here anymore. He was like a Jack Russell mix. And then Ellie Mae is, she's like a golden retriever mix of some sort.
They make some of the sweetest babies dog mixes. So, I love it.
I love an opportunity to show them off.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your joy. I think that probably brings all of us joy to see. And certainly it was a joy to hear your presentation. That was amazing. It was really a master lecture. So I think we've got 2 now master lectures that we can just take on the road. And if CFIR is hiring, I think you are their person. Like, you are their person for sure. You know it like the back of your hand. You're able to, I feel like, just advocate for their use. And so thank you for giving such an amazing detailed walkthrough with it and how to use the materials that they have available, and an application for your research. So we'll open it up here for any questions, and certainly you're getting some major love in the chat and by the reactions to your puppies. You can unmute or put a question in the chat if you would like.
Yeah, sorry, I know that was kind of like an overload. I wonder if I can, the little mapping tool that's like an e-supplement to the on the paper is really wonderful because it shows you like the old constructs with the new ones. And I mean, I really like the updates that they've made. As I mentioned, some of the qualitative work I've done with the CFIR, we had kind of, I saw that in their updates, some of the things that we had seen were kind of accounted for. So for example, the like needs of the patients being served by the organization just seemed like such a, very small way to take into account how patients influence implementation. And so I really appreciate the kind of infusion of recipients of the innovation, like throughout all of the domains now, and really kind of making a place for understanding implementation from either the patient or student or whoever the recipient of the innovation is. I think that that's really helpful. And I think, just again, some of the instruction that they give as far as making, taking these kind of broad terms and making them very specific makes it a lot more usable.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because that has been something that has been welcome for sure, this greater clarity and distinction. One of the things that might be helpful also, while we're waiting for others to come up with some questions that they may have, is just thinking about these particular to our talk today, supplements where often they're 1 year. How would you sort of maybe advise in using this, because it is such an iterative process, it takes time, there's all of these steps. Is there any helpful guidance that you can have on that, as best to, I mean, of course you have to take your time and you have to do steps and you have to be thorough and you need to do what you need to do, but any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, so for example, with the options project, we the needs assessment was a very small portion of like what we were funded to do and what we had time to do. And we started the project like right as the pandemic started. And so we really did have to like make our, really decide on what was most important for our needs assessment, like who to have conversations with. We, again, really kind of focused in on like these specific practices and like, how are people doing that now and what's getting in your way of doing it better? And we had very brief 15 to 20 minute conversations with as many people as we could. There were about three of us that were reviewing that data. So, we were getting it transcribed immediately, then summarizing it. And we had weekly team meetings where, we were looking over these data. And so, the second that we had an interview that pointed in a direction of a strategy, we kind of then started working through the other steps. So like introducing it and getting feedback on what other people's thought, people thought as far as how that, would serve us as far as one of the implementation strategies we needed to like move the needle on this project. And so, as soon as we started interviewing people, we were reviewing those data, discussing it with people within our internal and external facilitation team, and moving forward with whatever we could as we could do it. So, I think definitely not waiting until you have all of your interviews, reviewed. I think the rapid qualitative approach, which I know is the next seminar, is incredibly helpful for these short projects, because you really just summarize it and then pull out the information that you need that is specific to, whatever your research question is or that. So, and then I think really, if you're trying to do these like kind of very quick projects, and I think it's kind of hard for people that like love qualitative research with like me, like I want to sit and talk to everyone about everything. But in this context, we have like very specific questions and very specific determinants that we're focused on that, our projects actually have resources to address. And so focusing your interview guides or whatever surveys or data collections you have on like the important things, getting that data and processing it as quickly as possible, and very much making it something that's happening in parallel with everything else, I think was kind of how we handled it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I completely agree with your approach, and just bring that up because I think some do get lost into the lockstep, and it's more about the process and the outcome versus actually why are we doing this research and what are we actually trying to impact, and how can we do it in a way that is not that we would not do it ethically, but that in a way that's responsive in the moment and can be ethically responsive is my point. So wonderful. Well, thank you for that. I really love how you've also given very practical tools and locations to go. And for those of you who are part of the Implementation Science Hub, we have all of those located nicely identified for you in our resource folder for you. And if for the greater public who might be listening to this as part of the CFIR, the UAB CFIR website, we have an implementation science tab as well, where we are pointing to a lot of these resources as well. So we want this to be a service to everyone. So with that, if there are no questions, just want to extend our really deep thanks for this, and what an amazing job you did with this, Allison. I know it's a lot to cover. And again, I just think that we learn it in such a great way, and now really get the CFIR 2.0 and how to make it work for us. So thank you.